Good morning. It's really terrific to be here. My first time to Des Moines, and I got a chance to walk around a little bit yesterday, and I enjoyed the warm weather. I wouldn't say I brought it with me from Boston, but it was really nice to be able to enjoy some of that. And I'm very excited to be with you all today to really be part of this conversation that you're starting. And my job with this opening presentation is just to help sort of set the stage, sort of give you a sense of what's been going on and what is going on in the utility sector, in particular on the electric side. And then Doug is going to start to dive into some of the, so given all that, what do we do? And then we'll hopefully have some good time to have some discussions about that. So Bob already said a little bit about AEE, as we call it for short. We're a national business association. We've been around for about 10 years. And we have about 100 companies that are members of the organization. And they cover the whole spectrum of advanced energy technology, whether it's energy efficiency and demand response products and services, all what they call the smart grid, the intelligence that's going on through the electricity grid, developers of renewable energy projects of various sizes, and also we have quite a few members who we talk about them as our corporate buyers. These are companies that are committed to pretty aggressive sustainability goals and are looking to procure essentially 100% clean energy. And it's easier to do that in some places than others. So we work with them to help create an environment where they can achieve those goals. We also have a software platform that we call Power Suite. And this is a web-based tool for tracking all the activities that go on at all 50 state utility commissions, within all the state legislatures, and at FERC. So if you're having challenges tracking developments across the country, you can. It's a subscription-based tool, and it really helps you organize and keep track of all those developments as they happen. So with that, next slide, please. So I'll start with this slide that talks about what we ask from the grid. So there are a set of core expectations that have been around for a long time. This is what we essentially ask of our utilities. Everybody has access to the grid. We allocate the costs of that grid in an equitable fashion. We, of course, want safe and reliable electricity, and affordability is important. So these are all things, sort of the utility compact is sort of formed around these core expectations. And that's not changing, but we have a number of additional expectations that are emerging. Those are not, the core ones are not going away, but there's increasing talk, of course, about decarbonization and environmental concerns. In the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of that is starting to center around the concepts of equity and environmental justice. There are communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the energy system. In addition to reliability, we're talking a lot more about resilience. So extreme weather, effects and other things that the grid needs to be able to withstand and recover quickly from. We look for ways for customers to take more control over their energy uses and costs, whether that's on-site renewables or managing when they use it, what the sources are, being more efficient, being able to put control into the hands of the customer in new and interesting ways. And then, of course, we're preparing for a high DER future, and DER stands for Distributed Energy Resources. The utility sector and the energy sector in general has a pile of the alphabet soup. So you'll see some acronyms today, and I'll try to remember to explain them. But this is the catch-all for a whole range of distributed technologies. So those are all things that we're now also asking of the grid, in addition to all of those core expectations. And on top of that, you have some other pressures that are sort of leading to this transformation that we'll be talking about. In many places, infrastructure is aging and needs to be replaced, so that's a cost issue. Different parts of the country, load is either flat or declining, and that's how utilities get their revenue. So if costs are rising and revenues are flat, that can create a challenge. So how do you manage that? We have increasing amounts of variable renewables, wind and solar principally, and you're very familiar with that here with all the wind that you have in the state. And in other parts of the country, like the Southwest, it's a lot more about solar. And then, of course, there's cyber and data security as we sort of layer that information network on top of the electricity grid. So there's a lot going on, and how utilities are regulated and what motivates them financially, which is which is what we're going to talk about today, is really a really important part of addressing all of this. So I'll continue with every industry has its lingo. So these are some terms you might have heard that all kind of revolve around the same thing, around utility business model reform, or sometimes I like to call it business model innovation. There's been a lot of terms that have been coined around that: utility of the future, utility 2.0. There's some terms around the grid edge, so all the interesting things that are happening where the customer connects to the grid. So that's where you talk about the grid edge or transactive energy and the grid of things, which is kind of the grid equivalent of the Internet of Things. Distribution system operator, independent distribution system operator, distribution system platform. These are all terms that refer to the evolution of that utility. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, there was a report released that was called, we talked about the utility death spiral. And we don't hear the term much anymore, but it made quite a splash when it came out. And it was about this concept of if costs rise, then more people will look for technology to have them exit the system, and distributed resources become more cost effective, which causes more grid defection, which leaves more costs on the remaining customers, and you have this, as opposed to a virtuous circle, you have the opposite. Now obviously that hasn't happened, but it's a legitimate thing to think about as technology evolves, as it's deployed on the grid and so on. So these are all sort of related issues to what we're going to be talking about today. And then I just provide you a list of what, when we talk about distributed energy resources, what we mean: efficiency, demand response, which is being able to control how much you're using at a particular time. Let's say if prices are high or the grid is under stress, can you turn the knob down and reduce usage at a particular time? That's demand response. Distributed generation is solar, small wind, anaerobic digesters, the whole sort of family of small-scale generation. Then we have energy storage, which is a really exciting topic to be talking about now. It's really coming into its own. Obviously, electric vehicles and microgrids, which are small, sort of self-contained combinations of all of these things that are normally connected to the electricity grid, but they can island themselves. They can actually separate themselves from the utility system. Say the grid is out. There were some really great examples of this in the Northeast when Hurricane Sandy hit. There were hospital campuses, university campuses that ran for days on their own microgrids when the entire grid was offline. So that's another thing to think about as we talk about all this stuff. So I've already sort of suggested that big changes are afoot. These are what we see as sort of the big technology-driven trends. And the thing that's, I'm a lapsed engineer, as Bob, well, you can say lapsed, but I'm definitely a lapsed engineer. I'm a technology optimist, and spend most of my time now working on policy. But to me, what's really exciting is the underlying driving force behind all of this is actually the technologies themselves. So then the question becomes, how do we get policy right? How do we get the most out of these technologies over time? So large-scale renewables in many parts of the country, if you're building new generation, it's the cheapest form of generation on a cents per kilowatt-hour basis. Often, it's even cheaper than continuing to operate existing power plants, particularly coal plants, which have fairly high operating costs around fuel and maintenance and so on. Distributed energy resources becoming very widely available, more competitive, have all kinds of uses and value to offer, including local resilience. If you've seen the Ford F-150 Lightning TV commercials, it's all about vehicle to home and how this truck can actually support your local resilience. So that's an emerging theme that we're seeing as well. EVs in general are fundamentally altering transportation. At Advanced Energy Economy, we see electrification of transport as being a key element of this transformation. And it's not just about the personal vehicles, but about the fleets. And that poses some unique challenges and opportunities on how you charge a depot full of electric delivery trucks that have to all go out in the next morning, right? And then lastly, I talked about batteries a little bit. I'll show you a chart in a minute. They're really at an inflection point in the market. Change does not happen linearly with deployment of new technology. It's very, very nonlinear. So I'm going to go through kind of quickly a handful of charts just to show you how this industry is evolving. On the left here, you have solar installations in the US from '07 to last year. And these are in gigawatts, so a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, which is 1,000,000 kilowatts. And I always try to put this in terms that everyone can understand. A kilowatt is a hairdryer, right? So, so 30 million gigawatts, 30 million kilowatts, 30 million kilowatts, 30 million hairdryer. Solar was a 20 gigawatt market in the US last year, so that's about a 40, 50, $60 billion industry. Wind was around 12. The chart I have from the wind on the right only shows data through the first half of last year, but it was about a 12 gigawatt market last year, so really quite significant. And when I started doing work in this business, I looked back at some old data. In the year 2000, the entire solar market in the US was 4 megawatts. Last year it was 20,000 megawatts. So that's the evolution that you've seen since I've been working in this industry. Next slide, please. Here's a chart looking at storage deployment in the US. So there are market analysts that track this stuff. And you can see that we installed, there's the megawatts, which is the light blue, so that's the capacity. And then with storage, I also have to talk about how big the battery is. So megawatts is how much power it can deliver. Megawatt hours is sort of how big the battery is, how much energy can it store. So we installed about 3.5 gigawatts of storage last year, which is more than double over 2000. And you can see if you go back just 4 or 5 years, it's more than 10 times the size. And this chart's a little misleading because the final bar, that last bar, the dark blue one, actually goes off the page. Right? It's 10,000 versus 3,500 from the year before, so it really goes up through the ceiling. So there's a remarkable, like I said, nonlinear market evolution happening here, and I'll show you in a minute what the projection is for next year, and it's even higher. So this is data from the Energy Information Administration. It's a federal agency that tracks and compiles a lot of energy statistics for the U.S. and also those projections. So this is a projection for 2022 based on what they know to be the project pipeline for new generating capacity additions. And you can see solar's got another 22 megawatts in the pipeline. Notably, this is only utility scale projects, so it excludes the residential rooftop, the commercial rooftop, the smaller projects that don't get tracked. So the solar market is actually forecasted to be bigger than last year. Wind is going to be about another 8. That's the green segment of the little donut. Batteries is at 5.1, and again, remember last year was 3.5. This is 5.1, but this is only the utility scale, the grid scale stuff, so it's probably missing a lot of the distributed solar. So anecdotally, from talking to some of our members who are in the solar business, we know that when they are putting in systems on commercial buildings, about half of those systems now are going in with batteries. 5 years ago, it was probably almost none. Now, it's at least for the commercial buildings, it's about half. So it's a really significant change. So we're looking for renewables and storage to have another banner year. You can actually see there's some new nuclear going in. There's been a project, it's called the Vogel plant. I think it's in Georgia. It's in the southeast. They've been working on it for quite some time. There's been some delays, but they're finally going to be completing the two new reactors at that site in 2022. That's a little red. But if you actually think of that as carbon-free generation, when you look at this chart, basically 80% of what's going into the US grid is carbon-free capacity, which is really quite something. Next, please. This is showing you sales of light-duty electric vehicles. There was a little thing in 2019, 2020 called the coronavirus pandemic, so things flattened out a little bit. But if you actually compare that to how vehicle sales in general fared, EVs actually did incredibly well when sales of vehicles overall were falling quite precipitously. And you can see the bounce in 2021 with light-duty EV sales around 600,000 units. Incredibly, that's only about 4% of light-duty vehicle sales in the United States. We sell about 15 million personal, minivans, SUVs, light trucks, sedans, etc. We sell about 15 million of those every year. There's well over 200 million of them on the road. So this is still a relatively small percentage. But here also you can see the nonlinear nature of how the market evolves. If you look outside the US, you look to China, parts of Europe, these percentages are already a lot higher. So in some countries, I think like Norway, it's over half of all light-duty vehicles sold are electric. So again, very significant changes coming, lots of implications for the electricity grid on A, how you charge all these vehicles, and B, how do you actually take advantage of them as a grid asset. And I have a slide at the end which we'll talk a little bit more about that. One quick slide, this is just something I pulled from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They do a great job at tracking markets and economics for different technologies. This is from an annual publication that's called Tracking the Sun. And you can see what has happened to small-scale solar costs over the last 18 years or so, or 20 years or so, down very considerably. This tracks projects that are 5 megawatts and smaller. My rule of thumb is it takes about 4 acres for it to cover to get a megawatt. So this will be for projects that could be, say, up to 20 acres in size. But costs have fallen quite significantly. Obviously, they're starting to level out a little bit, but they still have some room to run. When you look at the really big projects that are particularly out in the Southwest, but all over the country, their costs are in the $1 a watt range. My old rule of thumb when I started this was the inverter was $4 a watt, the panels were $4 a watt, and everything else was $4 a watt, right? Like the soft costs, the racking, the permitting, everything. So you were up in 12, maybe higher dollars per watt, and now for these large systems, we're at $1, which is unbelievable. Okay, so what does this all start to mean for us? I tried to draw a picture here of what that future grid is going to look like. If I had a parallel chart that showed sort of the grid today, you have large power plants connected to transmission, and then the energy goes out in kind of a radial fashion to all the customers, and the power kind of flows in one direction. You have large power plants connected with high voltage down to low voltage wires and to customers. The new arrangement that's emerging is very different. Some of these arrows, if you can look closely, have arrowheads on both ends because we're going to see much more bidirectional flow, charging and discharging of batteries, homes with solar that have excess generation to sell, electric vehicles that can actually send power back into the grid when necessary. And it's a much more complex system, and this has implications for the kinds of investments that we need to be making in the grid itself, the kinds of financial incentives that we give utilities to make those changes, and also like roles and emerging roles of all the different actors in this space. So hopefully this chart kind of gets at that, some of that interesting complexity. Speaking of those roles, this is just a sampling of some of the things that we often talk about as changing roles for the utility, for the customer, and broadly the term the third party, the other entities, the unregulated businesses of all shapes and sizes, the kinds of companies that are members of the advanced energy economy, for example. What are the different roles? So the utility, could become more of a platform provider and operator, where if you think of like the internet backbone and all the devices you plug into it, there's an internet platform that we all connect to. Not always seamlessly, but the idea is to connect seamlessly to it. So will the grid evolve to something that looks a little bit more like that, for example? How does the utility enable the deployment and use of distributed resources? Is there a more localized market that they can create where transactions between, multi-sided transactions between different parties can take place? Or can they act as an aggregator of those resources? And I guess in some respect they actually are. They do aggregate in some respect now, right? All customers kind of roll up and are supplied by the utility, but different types of aggregation that they can sort of then sell that aggregated resource into a larger wholesale market. Third parties, obviously in our view, are a critical piece of this. They're the ones doing a lot of the innovation around new products and services for customers, developing and deploying new technology. So they are the providers of those technologies. They themselves can be the aggregators of the output of those technologies, and they can be selling services to the utility. So the concept of infrastructure as a service. Rather than the utility investing in an upgrade to a substation because that substation is at capacity, can the utility go and procure capacity relief from the customers on that substation? Is that a better way to solve the constraint? And how do you, and if it is, how do you make sure that the utility is incentivized to first identify that that's an opportunity, and in the event that the distributed solution is the preferred solution, how do they benefit? How can they go ahead and choose that solution over the traditional solution? And then lastly, the customer is key to all of this. Electric demand, not that long ago, was thought to be basically inelastic. The utility sized its system to meet that peak hour of the year, and everything had to be big enough. The wires had to be fat enough, basically, and the transformers big enough so that you could meet that demand every hour of the year.